Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Neville Bolt. I'm the director of the King's Centre for Strategic Communications in London at King's College London. And we welcome you to the second panel of today, following the first on disinformation and misinformation and fake news, which those who were fortunate enough to witness it, I think, saw a very stimulating and very successful discussion today. So we're going to take a slightly different tack, and I'll explain shortly. I'll introduce you to our panel of experts. But first, let me just anyway thank our partners, INSS in Israel, for their co-production and putting a lot of hard work and effort into making today possible. And then I welcome all of you around the world who are listening today, and that includes many of my own students from our master's program at King's in strategic communications, who I hope will be supplying us with plenty of constructive input and difficult questions for our panelists. So, memory construction in strategic communications. Okay, let me just give you a little bit of background why we're slightly, it would appear on the surface, diverging from this disinformation theme, although you'll realize quite quickly we're not. It is very easy in the way that strategic communications is applied and understood in today's politics and geopolitics. And by strategic communications, let me remind you what I'm talking about here is the shaping and shifting of long-term discourses, significant discourses in politics and geopolitics. And there is a tendency nowadays to overemphasize the message aspect. This is inevitable because it's about operationalizing and instrumentalizing on the part of states, governments, but also on the part of state challengers, revolutionary and insurgent movements, as well as global NGOs and even major transnational corporations such as big energy companies, high-tech companies, even big pharma companies. So there's a tendency to focus on the message. And perhaps what everybody is missing is perhaps what we should all be doing really is putting on our X-ray glasses and trying to look through strategic communications to see what is the underlying architecture, or if you like, where's the skeleton in the body of strategic communications. And our panelists today, I think, are all of a similar mind, that we need to look at the way that major influencers of discourses and big conversations, the way that they play with time, the way they try to understand time, past, present, and future, as a continuum that is there to be shaped in the business of constructing memories, which is not just about recalling the past, nor is it even just about forgetting the past deliberately. It's about actually shaping it, almost as a piece of modeling clay, and sculpting the past in order to take possession of the past, in order to be able to present the official, the common sense understanding of the way things used to be. The reason for that being that those who shape the past at least legitimize their own presence in the present tense, in the now, in search of an attempt to own the future. And so we're playing today with time, with the construction of memory, and we're going to look at it from very different aspects. But at the same time, we're trying to enrich the debate around, I suppose, what is strategic communications? What makes it tick? What's really going on behind this surface level of messaging? So at this point, I'd like to introduce you to our 5 distinguished experts. and I'll introduce them in the order of appearance. So we have with us Elena Lange Yanatamashvili. This is a Georgian name, which I still struggle with. Although Elena is Latvian by birth and still claims to be a very patriotic Latvian, but I think she's also acquired all the trappings of all the good trappings of being a Georgian as well. Elena is a senior expert with NATO's Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, which is headquartered in Riga in Latvia, and has a distinguished track record in strategic communications, and is a specialist in memory construction, and particularly how it applies, how it is understood through the medium of film. Second up today is Professor Gadiaia, who joins us from Jerusalem, who you're at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and you are in fact a professional sociologist, cultural sociologist, and I think brings a very different dimension to this discussion today. Really unusual understanding of what we need to be talking about. Third up today, Dr. Andrea Elner, who is also from King's College London, but from Defence Studies, but again with, I would argue, with a really quite an outstanding track record, having taught at numerous different institutions around Europe and in different guises, albeit a security expert, but with a background in literature studies, and also with a very, very wide understanding of how to apply her thinking currently also to cultural and gender issues. And then fourth on today will be Dr. Vera Micheline-Shapir, who is an author, Israeli, but of Ukrainian heritage, with an expertise in Russian strategic thinking, and is going to introduce us today. In fact, is going to take us down memory lane and to look at the relationship between contemporary Russian thinking in terms of, again, memory construction and strategic communications, and see what relevance the Bolshevik Revolution has to do with that. And then, last but certainly not least, Dr. Vinicius De Cavallo, who is also Mariano De Cavallo, who's also from King's College London, but is the head of the Brazil Institute and is Brazilian by birth and heritage. And I'm not going to tell you what he's going to talk about, quite deliberately, because I think he's going to throw a spanner in the works, as we say. For all our very clever theorizing that you're about to witness in the next 40 minutes, I think, to mix metaphors, I think Vinicius is going to pull the rug from under our feet right at the close. So a surprise in store for us. So enough of me. Let's move on to Elena. Elena, are you happy to begin and tell us what you want to talk about? So I'm going to give you roughly 10 minutes and just remind our audience today that this 2-hour session is broadly split into 2 halves. You'll be hearing in the first hour from our experts, and if I have the time, I'll ask them a couple of questions as well. But in the second half, in the second hour, the floor is open, and that's open to every one of you around the world to ask anyone, within reason, anything. Elena, are you happy?
Yes, I'm very happy. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. What Professor Bolt forgot to mention is that I'm also a documentary filmmaker. And this is why I recently have the habit of bringing the topic of film everywhere. This is also the reason why my today's topic is about Latvia's centenary and memory construction through film in that context. So my homeland, Republic of Latvia, celebrated its centenary 2 years ago in 2018 with a broad range of activities. And this centenary celebration was particularly important for us as a nation because out of these 100 years, we have been free and independent only for half of the time. And this centenary program included also a state-funded boom in local filmmaking. And many films that were awarded financing touched upon Latvia's complicated history. So I looked at what, why, and how was chosen as important to remember. And when the Latvian government announced this centenary celebration, what they said was, and I quote, that this is an opportunity to celebrate the country's 100th birthday honorably, respectably, and with pride and joy by telling the story of Latvia and creating the future Latvia. However, the word future does not find adequate representation in the centenary's film program. Out of 16 films which received financial support, so 7 documentaries, 5 fiction films, and 1 animation, focus on the past to a greater or lesser extent. And that constitutes 13 films out of 16, so absolute majority. And there has been a public discussion on what influenced the choice of films by the selection committee, but there is no clear explanation of the concentration on the past, since there was no such, so to say, official directive to follow. It just happened that way. And in fact, the government was actually encouraging for the film directors to cover a variety of topics and target, diverse audiences in all generations. So there were 32 proposals submitted in total, and it seems that the filmmakers themselves had chosen to link the thematic of their films largely to historic events, historic personalities, and time periods. And there was very little that spoke of modern-day Latvia, and only one documentary film triggers the discussion about Latvia's future. So this, I believe, is directly linked to the current worldview of the Latvian nation, which has been influenced largely by the events of the 20th century, where Latvia continuously had to struggle for independence and its place in the Western world. And it is also linked to the Latvian traditional cultural interpretation of human life and afterlife, where the dead are viewed as existing among the living and continue to influence the present and future. And probably that is why Latvians and Lithuanians are the only nations in Europe who have developed such a rich tradition of caring for cemeteries. It's even to the level of obsession, I would say, and celebrating the dead. And this tradition is directly linked to commemoration practices and sharing of verbal memory, also whilst gathering physically within a cemetery, for example, and thus keeping the memory of a nation alive through different times of turbulence and oppression. And this is how the Latvian language, tradition, and folklore have also survived through this verbal kind of sharing and memory sharing, because the first book in Latvian language was published only in the 17th century, which is very late if you think about it. So preservation of language and manifestations of culture in the vernacular language are key to forming nationhood and the nation state, according to Benedict Anderson. And it has also helped to keep the idea of Latvian statehood alive from the 19th century onwards. And also preserving the forbidden memory of the First Republic of 1918 and an unwillingness to undergo full Russification were also the drivers behind the independence struggle under the Soviet Union. So which historic topics do these 13 films of centenary speak about? I would categorize them as follows. So first is understanding the formation of Latvian statehood. The second theme is identifying national heroes in our past. And the third is survival of the Latvian statehood idea and human dignity under occupation. So I believe that this shows that there is a challenge to form a current Latvian national narrative identity, which would include independent Latvia after the 1991, so the modern day Latvia. And this has also been reflected in the ways how the Latvian political establishment has tried to brand the country internationally and how it has been talking to its ethnically divided electorate. Although the rhetoric is changing, there is still, I would say, no clear vision of the modern day Latvia that would be tied not only to the past, but rather showed the past paving a clear road to the future. So if we try to analyze this from theoretical point of view, then we have to look for an explanation in the understanding of historical consciousness. So namely, how an individual interprets the current based on conglomeration and the dialectic of past experience and future expectations. So my interpretation of the current historical consciousness of the Latvian nation is that it cannot comfortably move forward because it has not gained satisfaction from dealing with its past. In fact, in the short 30 years of regained independence, Latvia has not even grasped all the memory, all the micro-histories of the nation since the early 20th century, because it has almost always been either under occupation or at war, subjected to the so-called correct version of history imposed either by Germany or Russia. And therefore, the past still dominates the present in Latvia in a way that hampers future-oriented thinking. And this idea of microhistory has become particularly topical in the course of the 20th century, interacting with the ideas of post-structuralism and social constructivism, and the understanding that there is no one single national history, but rather multiple socially constructed coexisting realities, calls for a representation of these different memories, which help to assign a variety of meanings to what we would call, Latvian national history. And if we consider Paul Ricoeur's idea about the untold story, by which he means the collection of experiences, of memories that we can voice in order to form our narrative identity, then Latvia has several painful memory points which it has problem voicing. And Ricoeur says that once we make a choice and voice these experiences to form our narrative identity, we automatically take responsibility for them. But that can be done only when one feels ready to answer for them. So that narrative identity can also change over the course of time, and that we experience as individuals, as groups, and also as nations. And as Latvia struggles with coming to terms with its World War II legacy and the heritage of the Soviet regime, it is very difficult for the country to form this narrative identity. And interestingly, there are actually very few films which speak about World War II or Soviet period in the Latvian filmography, literally just a couple. And I think it's related to this traumatic memory, because with traumatic memory, there is a need for a period of distancing before such memory can be articulated as part of one's narrative identity. And I think even greater temporal distancing is required for such memory to be represented in film or otherwise. So the last 30 years of Latvian independence have obviously not been long enough. Coming back to the films of the Latvian centenary, another debate that has to be addressed is the suitability of a film as a discursive construct for speaking of history. And the reason why historians do not accept film as a legitimate form to speak about the past is because of the little attention that filmmakers normally pay to detail, accuracy, and causality, focusing on drama instead. However, if you think from the point of view of memory, then film is in fact a very suitable medium, which from the point of view of its elements and construction methods very much relates to human cognitive processes, to the visuality of memory and to formation of a narrative identity. It also constructs and at the same time also manifests what we call collective or social memory. And cinema has been forming our perception of history for the past 100 years, whether we like it or not. And film can play an important role in the construction and consolidation of the collective memory in the imagined community of a nation. The film tells us clearly what we as a nation care to remember and what we prefer to forget. And one has to remember that also outside of Hollywood, even in such small countries as Latvia, film producers and studios are largely the ones who try to understand the supply and demand of what the audiences are likely to watch and what film festivals are likely to accept, and offer therefore relevant films to the market. So I think for Latvia at this moment in history, it is time for hero searching and confidence building, which is reflected in the composition of our centenary films. So thank you very much, and I'll be very happy to take your questions.
Elena, thank you. That prompts so many questions, and that was fascinating, and it prompts so many questions, and I want to come back to you, but I'm not going to do it now because I think we need to get on a roll here. And what I want to do now is go straight to Professor Gad and to talk about trauma and constitution. Gad, over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me open by thanking you for this kind invitation and a roll of amazing speakers. And there is a surprise at the end. The promise is to be fulfilled. Professor Thornhill, a leader in the study of constitutions, stated recently that, and I quote, "The classical theory of constituent power suggests that the legitimacy of a political system is derived from an ex nihilo moment of foundation. Constitutions," he intimated, "come out of thin air. I beg to differ and do so by using the theory of cultural trauma. I suggest that beneath the legal jargon of constitutions lay cultural stories of trauma. Those traumas motivated authors to make sure that they will never recur. The traumas, I mean. The stories of constitutions that leaders often narrate in the preamble of the constitution eternalize a national traumatic memory. For example, some preambles tell of arbitrary taxation, some of ethnic cleansing, while still others about military colonization or the lack of representation under tyranny. Constitutions describe national humiliation and defeat and promise that such traumas will never recur. Consequently, traumatic stories of constitution become the foci and the constitutive driver of national political traditions and collective identities. My theory posits that past traumas constitute national worldviews that color contemporary perceptions and actions. Traumas stand at the basis of national culture and identity as they create narratives of origin, of identity, and of destiny. As Parr suggested, and I quote, "As the social field remembers, grieves, mourns, weeps over, and shares a sense of collective trauma, a political community emerges." I suggest that constitutional authors use traumas to set a trajectory of national sovereignty. In some cases, they made sure that future generations will understand why they codified specific rights. In some cases, they made sure that the trauma and its political lessons will be, and I quote, "constantly before all the members of the social body, so as to remind them continually of their rights and duties." And this quote is from the French Declaration of Human Rights. My theoretical model. Political leaders choose an historical trauma and use it in charting their nation's story of constitution. In the preamble or in the text itself, the authors eternalize the chosen trauma by providing the historical justification for turning humiliation and shame into national sovereignty. In doing so, the Constitution creates justification for the political tradition that they set on track, but also narrates a story of political destiny, of a future. Thus, the traumatic justification for the Constitution creates a collective identity for the long haul. The Constitution tells citizens where they came from, who they are, and what they or their nation and country stand for. I'll talk about two cases, Israel and Germany. The Israeli case shows that it is not the trauma itself that pre-writes constitutions. It is the moral lessons that leaders draw from the trauma which determine its moral and political spirit. Israel's declaration sets from World War II and the Holocaust, drawing a set of unique moral and political convictions. The Declaration of Independence from 1948 sets off with the trauma of exile and the longing for the return to the land of Israel. However, it is Nazi Germany and the Holocaust which loom large in justifying the urgent need for a national home for the Jewish people. And I quote from the declaration: "The catastrophe which recently befell the Jewish people, the massacre of millions of Jews in Europe, was another clear demonstration of the urgency of solving the problem of its homelessness. By re-establishing in Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, the Jewish state, which would open the gates of the homeland wide to every Jew and confer upon the Jewish people the status of a fully privileged member of the Committee of Nations." The trauma of the Holocaust and the nation's ignorance of Jewish plight led Zionist leaders to constitute Israel on a commitment for national self-defense. Israel's tradition of never again and its emphasis of self-reliance in what concerns its existence emanate from the ashes of Auschwitz. Its emphasis on a strong army with mandatory service also reflects the commitment to stand strong among untrusty nations. The suspicion of other nations also drives its chutzpah diplomacy. Some constitutions avoid mentioning the collective trauma that underlies them. Nevertheless, unmentioned traumas can still loom large over their spirit and clarify why the authors of the Constitution chose to codify specific articles. Such is the case of Germany. The preamble to the Basic Law for the Federal Republic of Germany from 1949 never mentions the Third Reich, the Holocaust, or the humiliating defeat in World War II. However, this traumatic history overshadows the spirit of the Basic Law and its articles. As the preamble to the Basic Law states, and I quote, "Conscious of their responsibility before God and man, inspired by the determination to promote world peace as an equal partner in a united Europe, the German people, in the exercise of their constituent power, have adopted this basic law." So after pouring calamity on peoples and nations, German leaders promised that their new political formation will come full circle. They proclaimed responsibility, world peace, and equal partnership in a unified Europe as the main values which will guide the new Germany. However, the trauma of the Third Reich impregnates the German political tradition and its collective identity after World War II. The horrors of the Gestapo and the Wehrmacht make for voluntary participation in a standing army. This is Article 12. The invasion of the Gestapo into people's private sphere motivates an unflinching commitment to privacy. Article number 10. The looting of Jewish homes in Kristallnacht makes for a firm commitment to the inviolability of the home. Article 13. And the expulsion of Jewish citizens and their murder during the Third Reich imprinted the conviction to never allow extradition or the violation of citizenship. Article 16. These and other articles explain Germany's unique position regarding refugees and its current prioritization of peace, human rights, and individual freedoms on all levels. Although repressed, the German trauma pre-wrote and continues writing Germany's unique political tradition and its collective identity. Now let us generalize. Stories of trauma and eventual victory or revolution provide people with existential answers to the questions of life. Who are we? Where did we get from? What is our eternal mission? The story of Constitution, if narrated through the story of trauma, war and revolution, helps uniting people in providing them with clear answers. National ceremonies, school textbooks help inculcating the story of Constitution year by year, forming a national habitus. For the Americans, the core of their national habitus is liberty and the suspicion of all power. For the French, equality and solidarity come hand in hand with liberty. Germans coalesce around a sense of responsibility for human rights, and the Israelis promise that the Holocaust will never happen again. Let me leave you with a final thought. The traumatic moments of their constitution set countries on distinct political trajectories. Those trajectories are only likely to change on the next historical jolt, the next world war, the next occupation of some empire that would send political leaders back to, namely to write anew their story of constitution and hence set a new political tradition and a new collective identity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was fascinating and very provocative as well, which is precisely what we're looking for. Just to keep this German theme going, I'm going to move on to Andrea now, Dr. Andrea Elner. Andrea, are you ready? You're going to talk on a German theme, aren't you?
I am also going to talk about on a German theme, absolutely. Yes, I am ready. I think if Gad and I had tried, we probably wouldn't have fitted together quite so well, because I'm hoping to shed light on the evolution of some of the aspects of German trauma and how the Germans dealt with that in their constitution, and how this shaped the German identity and political culture in the course of particularly the Cold War. What I might mention is that I spent quite a lot of my childhood and was brought up until I started living here in the UK, in Germany. So I was born in Germany, but have lived in the UK, and I'm a British national as well, for the last 2.5 decades now. But so I'm sort of Anglo-German in a weird way, which gives me quite a privileged perspective. I will be talking about memories of war over time and look particularly at the German case. But before I start, can I first say again, good afternoon or evening for that matter, some of us already are in the evening, but then also thank you all very much for inviting me to contribute to this conference, and Neville and the King's Center for Strategic Communication specifically for inviting me to contribute to this session. Over the next 10 minutes or so, I will reflect around the example of mainly West Germany, but then branching out into wider unified Germany. I will be reflecting on the contested constructions of memories of war, and drew out a number of insights on their relationship with strategic communication. But let me start with a personal memory. As a small child, I was regularly instructed by my grandmother to fold up my clothes neatly in a pile layered in a particular order. She told me this with a remarkable sense of importance. Much later, I asked her why. Her answer was, so you can get dressed in the dark fast. It still took me quite a while to figure out that this was actually in case of an air raid. Then I also knew why she always had candles, matches, and a suitcase in reach. The impact of war can be felt across generations, although it may be necessary to invest intellectual and emotional labor to appreciate the origins of memory and the reasons for its longevity. Although I never asked her, I suspect that my grandmother's concerns were kept alive in part by the biannual nationwide tests of air raid sirens and drills during much of the Cold War. We cannot assume that the truthfulness or completeness of memory, this and the need to contextualize and interpret historical memory, allow the past to be used for purposes firmly located in the present. For polities, the construction of memory is codependent with political culture, and that ultimately links it to strategic communication. This malleability also makes representations of the past vulnerable to manipulation. Fake news, or so-called alternative truths, are one of many manifestations of such distortion. Another is partial truth, which brings me to my first key point. Memory is a function of remembering and forgetting. Remembering and forgetting are deeply political. We've already heard reflections on these themes. They carry symbolic meaning. They shape a polity's identity and have legitimizing functions for power. Tony Judd observed in the early 2000s that post-war Europe was built on, quote, founding myths and forgetting, unquote, a form of what he called instant amnesia following experiences of the war and collaboration. This tells us that why, what, and how we remember or forget can depend on evolving political and strategic contexts. And this will shape the context, content, and approach to a polity's strategic communication. Where that balance is struck between remembering and forgetting tells us something about a polity's underlying ethics and self-perceptions, as demonstrated by the discourse around the constitutive dyad of German memories of World War II, and that is war crimes and crimes against humanity on the one hand, and the civilian experience of war on the other. Which aspects of this legacy German governments, elites, and society chose to remember or forget depended on the strategic context and was negotiated over the entire Cold War and beyond in morally often highly charged public debates. The immediate post-1945 wish to focus on rebuilding was also a search for a new identity and a Western alliance, combined with an impulse to forget, or at least not confront, the shame and guilt of the recent past. And yet, although forgetting appeared to be negotiable at times, the price was a complicated and lasting experience of different waves of fears, which Frank Bies charted in his 2019 alternative history of West Germany entitled Republic of Fear. The English version is due to be published this year. Initially, fears instilled by Nazi propaganda in the last year of the war, projecting vengeance and retribution from witnesses and survivors of German military and civilian atrocities, if Germany was to lose the war, lived on in the minds of West Germans beyond May 1945 without justification. They shaped attitudes towards victims and survivors of National Socialism. They shaped attitudes towards the three Western allies and the early evolution of post-1945 polity of West Germany. In the late 1950s, they crystallized over a government campaign for civil defense in case of a nuclear attack. References to the success of air raid protection measures during the war clashed with subjective memories of the devastating effects of Allied air attacks. Memories of the internal enforcement of compliance during the war generated fears of the re-emergence of an authoritarian state since the civil protection campaign was organized centrally. In that light, the Adenauer government's argument that Germany was following the example of the US and other Western allies was received less as an assurance than an indication of Germany yielding to another imposition by these external actors. The persistence of stereotypes of militarized masculinity led to a rejection of sheltering as effeminate. The cover photo of the accompanying public information brochure entitled "Everyone Has a Chance" thus showed a majority of men in business attire, a respectable role for the new civilian German man. The initiative was soon replaced by another. We might see this as a recognition of its failure at strategic communication, and we might discuss why it was dismissed. This case is also symbolic, however, for the tilted balance in public memory of a German wartime diet towards German victimhood amongst the public and national identity reinvention by the government. From the late 1960s, that balance began to be redressed. This was triggered then, as on so many occasions since, in public debates from, I do apologize. I lost my train of thought here, of argument here. Let's try again. This was triggered then, as on so many other occasions since, by interventions in public debates from critical scholars, public intellectuals, students, and some politicians. They persistently forced Germans, the public, other members of the elite, and governments alike to confront their past, acknowledge the guilt of the Holocaust and other atrocities, and recognize the unacceptable degree of continuity of people with a Nazi past in public life. These developments did not replace German fears. They transformed them, for example, into fears for the ability to sustain lived liberal democracy and the fear, or at very least the reluctance, of using military force. The results, one might even argue, the success of this transformation of the political culture could be seen in the reception by large parts of the public and amongst scholars of what Jan Werner Müller called the unfreezing of war memories in the unified Germany. In the course of the 1990s, psychologists found an unexpectedly large number of clients seeking their help with delayed effects of their traumatic wartime experiences as children. Some of these accounts formed the basis of published studies. Over the subsequent decades, other studies followed which collated witness accounts, some based on contemporary Second World War diaries, others on individual recollections later in life. At a political level, modernization and in some cases reconstruction of the infrastructure of what used to be the German Democratic Republic, combined with the anticipation of a series of major anniversaries of World War II events, led to interventions, for example, of political voices in Saxony demanding the recognition of German victims of the Allied bombing campaigns. The focus of many of these interventions on Germans as victims seemed to spell a return to the one-dimensional culture of German war memories of the early period after 1945. And yet, how far the German discourse on the political and moral dimensions of remembering and forgetting had come could be gauged by the critical engagement with these contributions to the public and scholarly debate. For example, Jörg Friedrich's 2004 problematic Popular or Populist History of the Allied Bombing Campaign of 1940-45, entitled The Fire, and an accompanying volume of images were heavily criticized for implying moral equivalence between the Allied air campaign and German atrocities, especially the Holocaust. The overarching tenor of the critical reception has been that there can never be victimhood without acknowledgement of guilt in German wartime memories. Constructing and reconstructing memories of the Third Reich and exploring its meaning for new generations needs to be an enduring project. The continued recognition of this may just be the salient recurring insight on which to conclude. Why? Because there is a moral, philosophical, and political imperative to continue to engage critically with the construction and reconstruction of this memory. That engagement needs to be as constitutive of the political culture of the unified Germany as it became of West German political culture. In this sense, the protection of critical engagement with memory construction from those who seek to forget, is in itself a matter of strategic communication. Thank you very much for your attention.
Andrea, thank you. Again, another fascinating insight into strategic communication and memory construction. I'm going to actually save my questions for later. And at this point, I'm going to actually suggest to all our participants who are waiting eagerly to talk to you that they should already start to, in the chat column, start to write their questions. You're all invited to join in, please do, and start writing now, thank you. And so I'm going to move straight on to Dr. Vera Michelin-Shapir, who's going to talk to us about the memory of the October Revolution in Putin's Russia. Vera.
Yes, hello, good evening. Thank you, Professor Bolt. Actually, how I was thinking to look at this case is to sort of look at how this artificial separation that happens in Putin's Russia between the memory of the Soviet Union, which is overall remembered as a good experience, and the memory of the October Revolution, which is remembered as a sort of problematic event in Putin's Russia. And I think that this is a good way to look at how the revolution is remembered, because this separation is an extremely odd sort of way of considering this historical periods, historical events, and so on, specifically because the revolution was so important, was so central in the Soviet memory, while the Soviet Union was still existed, and in Soviet strategic communications. So you cannot really imagine Soviet strategic communications without the October Revolution. And that worked both domestically and in foreign relations, in international relations. So domestically, the October Revolution was celebrated in the most important official holiday, which was the 7th of November. And this holiday had a very clear understanding. It provided Soviet citizens a very clear understanding of their past. So the October Revolution ended the evil Tsarist regime and began a new phase in history, a new and better history, a new and Soviet history. And this is where Soviet citizens could place themselves in time and space. And also, very importantly, it had a projection. The revolution has a projection to the future. It sheds light into the future. The revolution happened in 1917, and more revolutions are to come, and Soviet utopia and communist utopia, Soviet utopia will be constructed. Externally, it was also extremely important because the revolution was a sort of benchmark according to which Soviet leaders could place themselves vis-a-vis foreign states. So is it a revolutionary power? Is it a country on the way to revolution? Is it a capitalist state that we have to compete with? So it was a kind of, the memory of the revolution was central, and it was a perfect historical memory, perfect subject for strategic communications in the Soviet Union. What happened in the 90s was that this perfect memory, when Soviet ideology started to unravel, and it happened even before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it created a sort of, it unraveled, it broke into two, the memory of the revolution. So you had competing memories of the October Revolution that actually sprang while the Soviet Union was collapsing. It was already there in the early 90s. In 1991, on the 7th of November, groups of liberals and groups of communists both came out demonstrating on the streets. And liberals on that day were holding banners saying, this is the day of national tragedy. The Soviet Union is an evil state. It ought to collapse. And the October Revolution began a tragedy. Communists on the same day protested against democratic reforms, against Yeltsin and against Gorbachev. So this kind of competing memory of the revolution, it went on in the 1990s. And for these groups, it was very obvious that the revolution and the Soviet Union were bundled together in their memory. Yeltsin allowed for this competition to continue, and he actually didn't remove the holiday from the national calendar. So he tried to rebrand it as a day of reconciliation, to sort of facilitate reconciliation in the public. He was unable to do so, and what happened were these two competing narratives. And in 2000, as we know, along came Putin. And Putin made it known very, very early that he thinks that the Soviet Union was not such an evil empire. It was actually a great time, and we should remember it and cherish the good memories we have from Soviet times. But at the same time, in various quotes by Putin, he mentions 1917 and 1991, the year of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the year to which he refers to as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century and a great trauma for the Russian people. 1991 is equated with 1917. So it was obvious that he's creating, artificially separating the revolution from the memory of the Soviet Union. And there are also numerous quotes of Putin saying bad things or implying bad things about Lenin, who was cherished in the Soviet Union as the greatest leader, sort of communism with a human face. And it became quite clear that the revolution contradicts a broader ideological agenda that Putin was putting forward. And his agenda was an agenda of stability, continuity, and unity. And I think that it's important to note about this broader agenda, something that is being lost in the discourses in the West right now. Putin is often being described as sort of an agent of chaos, somebody who tries to undermine order. But the fact of the matter is that in his own mind, he's a status quo player. He's not trying to undermine anything. If anything, if you ask today, Mr. Putin, what is the greatest thing that you think that should happen in international relations? What is your sort of diplomatic goal? He will tell you that he wants to convene the group of 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So he has this vision, this very, very kind of static vision, sort of classical vision of how international relations should be run. And he intervenes and undermines what we see as an international order when he feels that the tide is going against this classical sort of order of 5 states ordering the world, and the tide, basically the tide of rapid globalization, and he's threatened by this tide of history. In fact, the revolution is kind of tied for him with these sort of disruptive events. And this problem is not only ideological for Putin, it's a very practical, a very political, obvious problem that happens in the former Soviet Union. And 2004 actually holds the key to understand why 1917 revolution is so problematic for Putin. In 2004, Putin removes from the calendar this 7th of November that Yeltsin kept despite the collapse of the Soviet Union. He removes it from the national calendar. Instead, he introduces a different holiday, the 4th of November, called the Day of National Unity. It's a very significant holiday for Russian strategic communications, but I don't have the time to speak about it. Basically, this is the ultimate forgetting. He wants to really expunge the revolution, not only say bad things about the revolution, he doesn't want the revolution to be remembered at all. And why it happens in 2004? It happens in 2004, it's not coincidental. This is the year when color revolutions began to happen in the former Soviet republics. So the Rose Revolution in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And for him, revolutions become not only an ideological problem, but a practical political problem in the sphere that he considers as Russia's natural sphere of influence. Again, going back to this understanding of international politics as a kind of 5 states that have natural spheres of influence. And if you think about it, when you hear rhetoric by Russian officials about the Arab Spring, you hear really very similar themes. If you ask Russians, am I getting a sign from Neville? Okay. You hear very similar themes about the Middle East as well. And actually, what I want to conclude with is that I'm saying that this kind of artificial separation creates an actual problem for Putin's strategic communication. And the problem is not only because it's a fragmented kind of narrative of remembering something and forgetting the event that brought it about, but also it structures time in an illogical way. And this is a real problem for strategic communication. Putin wants to see history as this kind of memory of uninterrupted events, a sequence of events. The problem with that is that they have no future. Where is the utopia? If the memory of the revolution in the Soviet Union was logical because it projected the future, the utopian future, this kind of politics have no future. And this refers to what Professor Bold noted in the beginning, that you want to own the future. And Putin actually forgoes owning the future by expunging this image of the revolution. And this has been noted actually, by other scholars. Timothy Schneider calls it the politics of eternity. Masha Gessen speaks in her book about the future is history, yes, always looking back. So this aversion from addressing the revolution, from addressing progress, from addressing the future is a real Achilles heel in Putin's strategic communication and in his historical memory. And it's not a coincidence that the main oppositionist in Russia, Alexei Navalny, constantly speaks about the wonderful Russia of the future, because he knows that this is the weakness of this regime, that this is a sort of an futureless state of being.
Vera, thank you. I find this discussion so far, I find this really exciting, and so many good ideas that are coming through. What's interesting is we're all clustered around a kind of nation state perspective and the relationship to the populations over time of the nation state. So at this point, it's only appropriate that we should go to Vinicius, who I think is going to problematize this discussion for us. Is that right, Vinicius?
Exactly, Neville. And thank you very much for inviting me to take part of this panel. I feel a little bit uncomfortable because as the last one, and after you said that I would come with something very original, I feel a little bit pressed about that, but let's try to make some sense of what I want to say here. I will be talking today, we have been hearing a lot about past, future, about memory, about dreams of future and visions for a future. But I will be talking today about a people that don't care about past or future. Or basically, they define their identity not because of memorial aspects. On the contrary, they define their identity by the immediacy of the experience. So I will be talking about a group, an indigenous group from the Brazilian Amazonia called Pirahã. I myself haven't been in touch with them, despite have been many times in the Amazonia, many years in the Amazonia. I haven't been in touch with the Pirahãs. I am based in my talk on the studies done by Daniel Everett, a linguist who has spent a long time living with the Pirahãs, describing their language and also understanding their way of life. They lived close to the Maici River in the state of Pará in Brazil, in the middle of the Amazonian jungle. Well, I have learned a lot about them through, as I said, Daniel Everett. And I think what we'll be talking here has connections with, first of all, their language, their culture, and again, the definition of identity that they have. About their language, some specificities that are quite interesting. One of that's about verbal tenses. I will be explaining better about that. They don't nuance as we do in our Western language and or Indo-European language, let's say like that, many aspects of past and future. It's a much more immediate, it's much more present tense language. The other aspect, it's a language that doesn't have any quantifiers, not only numbers, but also any sort of element that quantify aspects of the nature or the reality. The sense of directions is not based on the body-centric, like we have right and left, but in an exocentric, exo-body-centric. So they describe their relations to the world through upriver or downriver, for instance. Their culture, it's quite peculiar also because the relationship with the nature is obviously very remarkable, as I mentioned here, the question of direction. Contrary of what many anthropologists and linguists say, they don't have original myths. They don't talk about mythological past. They don't talk about how they create the world. They don't tell stories, basically. They don't narrate stories. There is no narrative in the sense of what we know as narratives, not only in past events, but also fictionalizing it. And they don't plan more than one day. They will not talk to you about what they will do after tomorrow. They just think about what we have today. So it's a people that do not talk about unexperienced events, such as long past or far futures events, or even fictional topics. So we are seeing how problematic the situation here when we are discussing about memory and the role of memory to build up identities or to communicate through memory aspects and to think about future in strategic communication terms when we don't have really a far future to talk about. So basically, they have an expression that we would call perhaps in Western language just now. They would just say what comes into my sight or goes out of my sight. That's their immediacy of experience. And that's, I think, is the most important element that we should keep when we think here, is the immediacy of experience. They only make statements anchored to the moment when they are speaking, rather than to any other point in time. And then come the amazing thing about the verbs, the verbal tense that I said. They use simple past, they use simple present and simple future in the sense of the relative to the moment of speech. So they have no perfect tenses like we used to have in, as I said, Indo-European languages. So only immediate tenses. I will give you an example. We have the sentence in English. When you arrived, 20 generations had already lived in this land. Typical narrative of memory, typical narrative of projecting future also, because give you the sense of historicity. Okay, when you arrived, the verb arrived is fine. You would see that in Pirahã language because it's relative to the moment of the speech. I'm still talking now, there was a moment just before. But 20 generations had lived. This had lived would not fit there, because it's not defined relatively to the moment of speech, but relative to the arrived, to the past already. So just come into conclusion here and try to bring together these ideas to what is, I think it's important here. Yeah, we are so used to discuss memory. We are so used to discuss narratives. We are so used to discuss identity through a model of language, Indo-European language, that gave us these structures of thinking, that framed our way of thinking and frame our way of needing memory to define ourselves. But this indigenous group in the Amazon, this ethnic group in the Amazonia, actually are teaching us or telling us that you can have a strong identity as they have. They are not an isolated language in the sense that, oh, nobody have been in touch with them. They have interaction with other people that are non-indigenous people or other indigenous group, but they have quite clear sense of what their identity. They conserved their identity, or they have what we could call, let's say, a tradition, but it's not a tradition based on the sense of memorialistic storytelling. They have a very interesting language that is not permeable as we are used to see many other languages of exchange words or mixing words. So this lack of permeability in the language also reinforces the sense of an identity, but an identity that is immanent. It's not transcendent. No, it's not identity defined or marked by memory. And then if we have no eyewitnesses, we cannot translate. We cannot talk about what we haven't lived. Just to conclude, the person who wrote this, that's the book that I mentioned most of the time here, Don't Sleep, There Are Snakes by Daniel Everett. Daniel Everett, when he went to live with the Pirahãs, he was an evangelical missionary from US with the mission to learn the language, translate the Bible, and obviously convert these people into Christianity. Well, what happened, and it's a quite beautiful aspect of the book, is when Daniel narrates that actually he lost his faith in the Christianity, in the sense because the Pirahãs actually told him that they didn't need to think about salvation in afterlife, and they didn't need to explain their existence in that moment, in the Henk ek Nunc, based on past experiences. They were not imprisoned into this fantastic, wonderful thing that we have called memory. They were free of memory, and that were the strength or their identity. So that's, I think, the shocking aspect that Neville said that I would be bringing here. It's like saying, how can we imagine an identity, a people that define themselves without the need of being imprisoned by this memorialistic aspect? Especially cultures, as European cultures, or as I said, Indo-European language cultures that framed systematically my sense of meaning. It depends on what happened before to my people and what's the future for my people. Well, Pirahãs are living there for generations. They are there before the Portuguese colonizers arrived. They survived that, they survived everything, and they're still there living as Pirahãs without the need of discussing the role of memory, because what is important is the now that they are living. I will finish here with more open questions than conclusions on that. I think my role is more to provoke us to think about how much language also frame our way of dealing with memory, and what we think that is an experience of the all humankind can be very different if we think differently also on these aspects of language. I hope that it was not so frustrating for you to wait until this end to something that was not what we're expecting as a bomb, but at least I think these ideas will be a very good counterpoint to the discussions that we are having from the beginning of this panel now on memory and the need of memory, and especially how to deal with that in strategic communication. I would put this question, how we can communicate strategically without the need of memory then? Thank you very much.
No, thank you, Vinicius. And that's a great question. But let me just ask you very quickly. So you mentioned the hink and inunk, but the here and now. But so this is experiencing the here and now, but do they actually have the ability or choose to have the ability to step outside themselves and look back in on themselves and to examine the concept of time and space?
That's, again, it's a question that would never fit into that mentality, because that's a question that we have. These questions of in and out, it's framed from our language, it's framed from our cosmology, and even for our ontology. So that's I think the revolutionary aspect of Pirahãs and why they are so peculiar in this sense is that this is not the question that interests them. You don't need to ask about who I am, because, well, I am just part of this nature that live as every day we wake up and we go to sleep. So this sort of immanent experience, it's I think the strongest point here, this aspect of immanence. There is nothing that is outside my immediate experience. I don't have anything that is not immediate experienced. I will not talk about my future or my past, because what I am, it's today.
Fascinating. And it throws everything up in the air, of course, as you say, when it comes to trying to build this theoretical construct around strategic communications. So where are we on time? I'm going to go straight to our other participants who are scattered around the globe and keen to get involved, and they've already been writing to our expert panelists. So let me start with Elner, who spoke to us nearly an hour ago, and I'm looking at a question from Smaranda. So Smaranda asks, apart from films, who controls or shapes collective memory? And she's interested in narrative creators of today, and mentions, are we just looking at filmmakers, or should we be looking at musicians, historians, media, and state leaders?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think the thing with the collective memory is that it's a process that we don't fully understand, and it is all about the interaction and the change that happens when we interact with each other, and we influence the collective memory, and then the collective memory influences us. And it is a kind of a chicken and egg situation. You can't actually tell what came exactly from where. But if you look at what, for example, Maurice Holbach writes about collective memory, if I'm not mistaken, I think he actually emphasizes the importance of the family in the formation of collective memory, because we are most influenced by those people who are the closest to us, and family obviously are the closest to us. And they are also the ones who give us the first introduction to the rituals. And rituals are extremely important for maintenance of collective memory, and also for constructing collective memory. But I think if we come back to, for example, to the idea of a nation, and to Benedict Anderson and the imagined communities, then as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, that mostly products of culture, what we would call them in the vernacular language, are the ones that form the idea of a nation and this collective understanding and memory. So yes, anything, books, films, music, folklore, and you can expand also on the idea of a language. So I think probably, yes, those two things. Of course, governments can also play a role, but what we have to understand is that they do not operate in a void. They don't start from nowhere, from a blank page. And actually, the more they, dig into the roots of our collective memory, the more successful they are in their communication.
Mm. And Sophia wants to follow up there. Elena, with you, and she's asking whether or not the films that were commissioned or funded by the Latvian state, do they only focus on World War II and Soviet occupation? Are there any other historical events that were drawn out as a way of constructing?
Yeah, actually, I think there was maybe a misunderstanding. So what I was saying is that actually there is very little film that talks about World War II and the Soviet occupation. So these films largely focus on the very first formation of or self kind of conscious understanding of Latvians as a separate ethnic group. Or formation of the idea of the nation. So we would be talking about films that talk about events of, 12th, 13th century, for example, the Baltic tribes. Then we would see films that talk about, 1905, that period. We would see films that talk about the First Republic and the life during the First Republic, which is kind of a, sacred period. And then the Soviet period would maybe be more kind of in the background. So there are films, for example, about the ending of the Soviet Union. That is a film about a family with little girls who are kind of alone in the countryside, and they just hear these events happening on TV and on radio, and that they start getting this understanding that something big is going to happen. Sorry, what was the original question? I got carried away.
I think you're there. And let me move on. Just going back to Vinicius, Russell Smith asks an interesting question. Could a memory-free society ever be constructed now in our present world? Which I think also raises the question of how do they, with their being totally absorbed, existing in the now, the here and now, what happens when that here and now comes into contact with the outside, the broader nation state understanding of time and space?
Yeah, well, I think first, it's difficult to talk about construct societies. No, I think societies, they are a result of a natural process of construction. So I would not say that we can construct a memory-free society. There are societies like this one, that culturally, linguistically, didn't need the sense of memory to make sense of themselves. So what I'm saying is, we are not here talking about paradigmatic change. We are talking here about syntagmatic change in the sense of way of things. We are talking about other cosmologies, other ontologies, other epistemologies that doesn't fit into the categories that we are using. So as I'm reading Russell's question here, isolate society. Well, from our perspective, they are isolated, but they are a society by themselves. So I think when we deal with the case of Pirahan, it's really putting in challenge all the sort of questions that we have about how we configure senses of societies. And it's quite easy to us to try to understand or to try to project all over the world we are the same, we are humans sharing the same values and same meanings of what it means to be humans. And again, how they relate to the other societies. They relate with as another being, not necessarily human being. There is one very interesting episode in the book that Everett mentioned that sometimes he was there, but they talked to him. He spoke in the Pirahan language, but sometimes they talk among themselves, referring to Everett as he was not there. Like, oh yeah, I asked Daniel something like that. Everybody saw, Daniel is seeing that they were talking about him as he was not there. So the conception and perception of being, it's different from what we are used to look at. Therefore, the relations with outsiders, it's a relation with a total otherness. It's a sense of really otherness, and they are not so worried in search what we have in common and what we need to take from them in the sense. No? That's, I think, what is very revolutionary and difficult to us to really exercise putting ourselves in that position. And just before I finish, I saw the question of Alfredo Crocco, and they don't have tattoos, they don't have any figurative arts either. So there is no sort of transforming this experience in anything that is external to them as well.
Thank you. Giovanna has an interesting question for Gad, which is, Gad, you talk about these major jolts that are required to actually change the trajectory of the way a country perceives itself in its strategic communications. So she's asking you, Giovanna's asking, are there minor jolts as well? Are there more incremental changes that you would consider in your theory?
Well, there are processes of construction and reconstruction always working, but at least in the case of Israel, we speak of traditions that go 3,000 years back. Just to give you a minor example, every year there's a ceremony, the Passover holiday, and there's a process of reading the story of the Jewish people going out of Egypt 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years ago. And we have a short version for the very long night. They tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. So it's a nutshell of the history of the Jewish people. And small acts of trying to make a change into this very long story are incapable of changing it, because the entire tradition revolves around a national calendar that repeats year after year, ceremony after ceremony. In school, the memory is worked upon on a Jewish calendar that brings up the trauma again and again. So changing that would require changing of the calendar. It's changing of the entire worldview. I don't see small changes making any transformation in this story.
Gad, thank you. Mimi asked the question of Andrea. And Mimi's asking, Andrea, do you have suggestions as to how Germany managed to deal with its wartime past without embellishing or glossing over unpleasant events compared to other countries which have clearly not managed to come to terms with that?
Yes, thank you for that question. The short answer is with difficulty, because it is not a straightforward process. If you look at phases of West German post-war history, and I can't really speak about the GDR and that experience, because being tied into the Soviet universe made for a very different experience for the public and governments in the GDR. Which then translates now in a different and difficult experience in the unified Germany. But West Germany, you had, as I said in my sort of hinted at in my talk, that there wasn't enough time to sort of expand on this. It had an initial impulse to also really not remember very much and not confront. And you get some of this in the debate in the 1990s and 2000s and 2010s on the whole question of German war trauma, which then in some ways was criticized and often justifiably criticized for just focusing on the injuries and the trauma of the German population, without actually putting it in the context of the German population having supported a government that was ready and very much prepared to launch an aggressive war, commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then only the last years of the war, the tide was turning, and then the trauma set in. Now that trauma may be real, but it still needs to be seen in context. You can't really establish moral equivalence there. However, what happened in West Germany is that after the 1950s, where you really had also very much of a focus on focusing on this experience of particularly the Allied bombing campaign and the invasion and the occupation. And the German government trying very hard to reinvent national identity of West Germany and trying to position Germany as an ally in the Western Alliance, because that's where it saw the future for Germany. And it wasn't really until the 1960s, and this is where the German 1968 student revolts differed from the student revolts in other countries. They were also concerned about Vietnam, but they very strongly focused also on asking the generation of their fathers and grandfathers, what did you do in the war? Whether that was in a military or in a civilian context, and really highlighting the fact that there were a lot of people with a Nazi past who had not been denazified by particularly American initial efforts in government, down to local government, in industry, in politics, in academia. And so this discourse was really dragged out, this forgetting, that this memory was dragged out from a tendency to want to forget into the present in the 1960s. And once that had happened, it was more difficult to push that back into that particular genie back into the bottle, which doesn't mean that there wasn't a constant veering and hauling between those who very strongly wanted and felt the need and the moral imperative to engage with these questions. There was a veering and hauling between them and those who wanted to forget. And you see that towards the end of the Cold War again, when there were big commemorative events of the Second World War, and the famous huge dispute between historians broke out in the late 1980s about whether it was time to forget. Now, when we're talking about the kinds of crimes that had been committed at the Western Front and the Holocaust and other atrocities, then when do you decide it is time to forget? That is probably something you can never forget. And it may be something that's of relevance for Germans, but also for other countries. And it was these internal dynamics of Germans wanting to understand why it happened and what the consequences were for the new generations. And in a sense also the degree of forgiveness that happened after the end of the Second World War, when the Marshall Plan was applied to Germany, when Germany was accepted gradually into a Western, into the Western fold, which was partly a strategic calculation, simply because Germany was the front line in the Cold War. But the government took that as an opportunity, but also saw the responsibility. And I think that is partly one of the reasons why Germany was able to do this. If you're thinking about Japan as a comparator, it is different. And so I have discussed these questions with Japanese people, and one of the striking explanations I once had was that the way in which the Japanese approached the end of the Second World War was very much through a sense of preserving one's own honor, which meant that's one aspect of why committing suicide and killing others was part of this, because there was this idea that it was dishonorable not to rather die than be captive, for example. And I suppose the other big element was that Japan could see itself, and was victimized through the atomic bomb. You know, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a massive impact. And so that there were two different narratives overlaying each other. and they were in conflict with each other, and one probably hindered the remembering and the engagement, the critical engagement with one's own immediate past, because of the experience of being a target for 2 atomic bombs. I suppose these are sort of some of the key elements that distinguish Germany, but for Germans it was very much, it became almost a habit in public memory, in public discourses, to question and to ask and to see the responsibility. And then in addition to that, there was a world looking at Germany, holding Germany to account. And very rightly, Israel was very much holding Germany to account. That didn't happen in the same way to Japan. And so if Germans wanted to shun their responsibility, there was someone there who said, no, you cannot shun that responsibility. And they had every right to do that. So I think it was this mix of factors which played together, which forced Germany to actually see what's been going on. And if I look at other discourses, the post-imperial discourse in the UK, for example, there's a much greater reluctance to see and acknowledge that the other perspectives might highlight failings of the past, which ought to be highlighted. You know, whether we're talking about slavery or the history of Ireland, or general imperial past, colonialism, there is a lot of reluctance to engage with that as critically, because there's no external. Germany lost the war, and it lost the war quite decisively, and there were other powers forcing Germany to see what it had done. And that was a good thing, ultimately, I think.
So Andrea, consequently, Alex is asking you, is Germany crippled by its Vergangenheitsbewältigung? Does it hold back, he says, from taking a more assertive role on the global stage, very much at a time when Germany needs to come to the fore and offer some kind of leadership?
Yeah, that's been a running theme for Germany since really just before the financial crisis. And it's got Germany in very hot water with the Greeks, for example, where that didn't go down well very much at all. So I think the German position on the question of leadership is the world probably had enough of a German leader, then called the Führer, and so it's not going to lead from the front. However, so this question is actually not just a 21st century question. It arose fairly quickly over the EU's aspirations to become a military active power, to become a peace builder or at least conflict manager, with regard to the Bosnian scenario. And Germany made a few missteps at the start, but then there were also diplomatic missteps. But then there were also calls for German active engagement in a military realm, which from a German perspective was horrific, because the pacification of German society and German approaches to political problems, including foreign and security policy, had been quite comprehensive. And there was a very strong mistrust of Germans of their own sort of power. And they were not keen to throw their military weight around. And that was justified, because I think if Germany had got militarily more involved in the Balkans than it did, and it did get involved, but very much behind the scenes in the margins, then a whole host of World War II memories and factions and alliances and memories of those would have almost inevitably been dragged back into an already bubbling cauldron of the descent into war in several Yugoslav republics. So staying out of that was a good thing. What Germany did do in 2015, for example, was to say, right, we have a serious migration crisis here, and we need to help these people, because they are either migrants because of war, or asylum seekers because they are persecuted, and there is a legal right to asylum, which is very close to Germany's heart. But there is also a legal right in Germany, there is a right to be protected from war. So the Germans took in huge numbers of people in 2015. And then they were left alone, almost entirely. There weren't that many countries that also queued up to say, yeah, let's help this whole, we collectively through NATO and our actions in Libya, for example, we also helped create this problem. Syria was a long-term consequence of the involvement in Iraq. Germany stayed out of this, maybe justified in the long term because it didn't exactly go particularly well. So German leadership sometimes is more from behind than from the front, and that's for good reason. For example, by staying out of certain endeavors, which hasn't necessarily made Germany very many friends, because sometimes Germany is also seen as not being prepared to pay the blood price for what is deemed to be a desirable collective security policy, or the enactment of a desirable security policy through the use of force. The other thing Germany has done, or the current German government has done over the relationship, the transatlantic relationship, is to emphasize very strongly in its interaction with the US under President Trump that Germany stood for liberal democratic values and was going to defend them in the face of American different ideas about how America should engage and conduct itself under a Trump presidency. And I conclude on this. I heard the other day before the elections in the US, an ambassador to, I think it was a former ambassador to the UK, saying, well, everyone really has been very happy to say, well, President Trump is a bit strange, but we need to engage with him. He has some good points, and we need to engage with him because America is an important power. Germany did not. They just stonewalled, and they did not want any engagement. And I must say there are very, very, very few moments when I'm a little bit proud of being also a German. But that was a moment where I thought that is standing up for principles. That is standing up for a principle that is very much the result of the long-term digestion of what happened during the Nazi era. And I think that's a good thing. And I thought that was another way of showing leadership, which then doesn't force others to come along. But if others wanted to join, then they would be more than welcome to join. So I hope that goes some way towards answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. Before we close our live broadcast, I'd just like to direct a question which is actually written for Gad, but I'd like to direct it at everybody. Because very shortly we'll close the live broadcast, but we're going to continue with all the students until the top of the hour. So Harry wrote a question for Gad, and he said, is it possible to imagine, so think of this as the kind of the opposite end of the spectrum from what Vinicius has been talking to us about. Is it possible to imagine a process of constructing supranational constitutions based on traumatic memory that transcend borders? Big thinking. Can we conceptualize some form of international constitution even that would be based on trauma experienced by humanity as a whole? For example, pandemics or climate change. So first to Gad, and then I'd just like to hear what all our other experts have to think about that.
Well, yes, and I think we do have examples like the UN Charter for Protection of Children, for example, from 1947, I think. And that comes from collective traumas that go beyond national borders. So one can imagine coalitions, international coalitions, which create accepted norms, you know, we have the code of conduct in war, which is an international agreement of what you can do in war and what you cannot do in war. So those are examples that actually provide a good example. So yes, you need a good trauma to create an agenda that unifies different nations around an agenda. It is possible, it happened in the past, and it might happen in the future as well. Let me just make a footnote for Andrea's take. Israel and Germany have launched bilateral relations as early as 1956. Ben-Gurion and Adenauer, it took 10 more years until formal diplomatic relations were created, but as of 1956, collaborations between the two countries, especially in science, took place. And then we have cultural collaborations, yet, even 70 years later, when you speak to Israelis, they have something, some memory, some problem dealing with Germany. It would not be on a person-to-person basis, but Germany as a concept is still remembered yeah, sometimes Germany is terrifying. It's inconvenient to be in Germany. You have memories coming, surprisingly, what Sigmund Freud talked about, the return of the repressed. Israelis feel whilst in Germany that something they don't want to remember comes back again, and that's the memory of the Holocaust. So even after 70 very good years of collaboration between Germany and Israel, the memory is still very active.
Let me open that, put the same question to Vera. Vera, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, so kind of a human trauma that sort of brings people together. I mean, I think and I think that this is a theme that came up in the questions that we see in the chat. I think that actually, and there were a couple of questions about sort of how memory is, how social networks impact memory, and whether authoritarian leaders look to the past because they need this kind of unifying power to memory. And I think that really what happens today, and this is something that Putin, for instance, somebody like Putin would really not like, is actually what Alina started with in the beginning, is that we see more and more micro narratives. So because trauma is subjective, and because we're living in an age where the power of communications with the rest of the world is sort of fragmented, is given to everyone. So it's actually an age of enhanced micro-narratives. So you have more and more micro-narratives. You have more and more subjective understandings of trauma. You have more and more of these kind of conversations going on. And so I think that actually we're heading in a different direction, and the people who are kind of trying to bring us to the pole of kind of having a unified understanding of how we perceive ourselves, of how we look to the future, are actually people who are more in the realm of Putin, or some kind of a neo-authoritarian understanding of history. And what you're seeing now is kind of this more and more fragmented. There was a comment here also about kind of the personal narrative, that the personal narrative is the only real narrative of trauma that people today can sort of relate to in a more pure way. So I think that this is a direction that we're heading towards, and I don't think it's a particularly bad one. I do think, though, that it does have a problem again, and this is a problem that I've discussed in my presentation. It does have a problem that shares with others who construct memory in a kind of more backward-looking way. So sort of looking back, is that where is it taking us? I mean, this variety of voices where they're not kind of brought together by institutions that are trusted and mutually agreed on, like constitutions, which are really, constitutions are creatures of, say, a more classical age. So when we don't have that, when we don't have these streams that bring us together, then, you know, we're heading, I mean, where is this heading in terms of narratives? And maybe it's actually, we are being freed of this kind of, you know, more oppressive memory, as maybe we are heading towards that kind of direction of more like a state of being in the present. And we're not actually acknowledging that this is what technology is doing to us right now.
Vinicius, just a very quick point from you before I actually have to wave goodbye to our live broadcast listeners.
I'm sorry to jump there, but it's another subject that I would like to bring, different from what I said. What Neville didn't say is I'm a musician in my second life, my second ontological existence, and I conduct orchestras and choirs. And 2007, I performed in Brazil with 150 children, the children opera called Brundi Bar by Hans Krasa. This opera is quite connected to the memory of the Holocaust because it was performed 52 times in Theresienstadt concentration camp in Czech Republic by children that were prisoners there. We translated this opera into Portuguese with one survivor from Teresine who sang while she was a child there. And I was having deep discussions with myself, what is the ethics of memory involved in performing this opera in Brazil in 2007 with children in Brazil that actually haven't even studied about Holocaust yet. So this question of the ethics of memory, I think is a quite important element to bring into this discussion. And I think if we can manage to move this macro memory, especially these macro traumatic memories, into micro experiences of sometimes like the opera static one, I think we manage also to help to share this sense of one collective memory, if we would call like that, but that support a transition for a less oppressive history if we look in future. And I would strongly recommend the book by an Israeli philosopher, Avishai Magalit, called exactly The Ethics of Memory.
Thank you, Vinicius. On that note, we're just going to wave goodbye to all our live viewers because for them it concludes the first day of this international conference. We'd like to thank you for attending and participating, and the second day will take place next Thursday at the same time. Once again, many, many thanks to you.